November 15th, 1852, Fairmont Manor, just outside Richmond, Virginia. The dining room gleamed with crystal and silver, candles flickering across mahogany that cost more than most men earned in a lifetime. 8 plantation owners sat around that table, laughing, toasting, cutting into roast beef with knives sharp enough to split bone. They spoke of profits, of cotton prices, of human cargo sold like livestock at market. What they didn't know was that in the kitchen, their gravy was being stirred with more than just flour and drippings. It was being stirred with 20 years of silence, 20 years of watching, 20 years of remembering every name they'd erased from the world. Her name was Richmond Cook, though that wasn't the name her mother whispered when she was born. She was called Richmond because that's where they bought her, called Cook because that's what she did. But what she became that night was something else entirely. Something they never saw coming. A woman who understood that the difference between seasoning and poison was just a matter of proportion. Before we dive deeper into this story, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. And don't forget to subscribe, because stories like this one don't make it into the history books, but they should. The gravy boat passed from hand to hand like communion wine, rich, dark, perfectly seasoned. Colonel Harrison dipped his bread deep, savouring the taste. Judge Morrison poured it thick over his potatoes. Dr. Whitmore, who'd spent his morning calculating the market value of children, licked his lips and asked for seconds. They ate with the confidence of men who'd never questioned where their food came from, who'd never wondered about the hands that prepared it. Richmond stood in the shadows near the serving door, white apron clean, head bowed, watching every spoonful disappear. Her face showed nothing. Not satisfaction, not fear, not the 20 years of rage that had been simmering in her chest like soup left too long on the fire. She just watched and waited, because patience was the only weapon they'd ever let her keep. The first to fall was Judge Morrison. He pushed back from the table, hand to his throat, eyes wide with confusion. Then came the sweating, the shaking, the way his face turned the colour of old parchment. Colonel Harrison tried to stand, made it halfway before his legs gave out. One by one, they collapsed. Some at the table, some on the Persian rug their money had bought with other people's blood. Dr. Whitmore, the one who'd proclaimed that black flesh felt less pain, crawled toward the door on his belly like the snake he'd always been. None of them made it far. Richmond didn't move from her spot in the shadows. She watched them convulse, watched them foam, watched them discover what powerlessness tasted like when it came from a kitchen instead of a courthouse. Long before that November night, long before the poison found its way into the gravy, there was a girl with a different name in a different place. She was born in the Carolina Lowcountry where the rice grew tall and the mosquitoes sang lullabies of malaria. Her mother called her Aduni, which meant crown in the language they'd carried across the ocean in their bones. But crowns don't survive the auction block, and neither do the names that remember them. She was maybe 8 when the men came, maybe 10. Time moved differently when you belonged to someone else, measured not in birthdays, but in bruises, not in seasons, but in sales. Her mother fought when they loaded her into the wagon, fought until the overseer's whip painted her back red, and her voice went quiet forever. The last thing Aduni heard was her mother screaming her real name across the rice fields, over and over, until distance swallowed the sound. The Richmond slave market smelled like fear and horse dung, and the kind of desperation that makes grown men weep. She stood on the auction block in a dress too big for her frame, bare feet on splintered wood, while white hands poked and prodded like she was livestock at county fair. They checked her teeth, her muscles, the calluses on her palms that told the story of work already done. A plantation owner named Thomas Fairmont bought her for $300, cash paid, no questions asked. He needed a kitchen girl, someone small enough to fit in tight spaces, quick enough to learn. young enough to break properly. That's how Aduni died, and Richmond Cook was born, with the scratch of pen on paper and the clink of coins changing hands. Fairmont Manor wasn't the worst place to be enslaved, but that was like saying drowning in shallow water was better than drowning in deep. The house sat on a hill overlooking the James River, white columns holding up the kind of southern grandeur that looked beautiful from a distance and rotted from the inside. Thomas Fairmont fancied himself a gentleman, the kind who quoted scripture while counting human property, who spoke of Christian duty while separating mothers from children. He didn't beat his slaves often, not because he was kind, but because damaged goods brought lower prices at market. Richmond learned this lesson early. Survival meant being useful, invisible, forgettable. It meant swallowing your real name so deep that sometimes you forgot it yourself. The kitchen became her world, a universe of cast iron and flame, of endless meals for people who saw her as furniture with hands. She learned to cook from old Mary, a woman whose back was bent from decades of stirring pots and whose eyes held the weight of every child she'd watched sold away. Mary taught her more than recipes. She taught her which herbs eased pain and which ones caused it, which roots could heal a fever and which could stop a heart. Knowledge was the only inheritance slaves could pass down, and Mary passed it all to Richmond, like gospel whispered in the dark. Lured together in a year's BL rhythm of dawn to dusk labour. Richmond grew from girl to woman in that kitchen, her hands learning the feel of every pot, her nose memorising every spice. She cooked for dinner parties, where plantation owners traded stories of profit and loss, where judges discussed new laws to keep the enslaved in chains, where doctors debated whether black people felt pain the same way white people did. She served their food with steady hands and downcast eyes, but she listened to every word, every boast about a slave sold, every joke about a woman taken, every casual discussion of human suffering filed away in her memory like recipes for future use. It was during one of these dinner parties that she met him. Jacob was his name, though she never knew if that was what his mother called him, or just another name given by another master. He worked in the stables, had hands gentle enough to calm spooked horses and eyes despite everything held light that still the world had tried to take from him. They spoke in stolen moments behind the smokehouse, in glances across the yard, in touches that lasted just long enough to remember what tenderness felt like. Love wasn't supposed to exist in bondage, but it grew anyway, stubborn as weeds through cracked stone. They planned to run together, north to freedom, to a place where they, Bill, could choose their own names, their own life, raise children who would never know the weight of Chain's stories of conductors on the Underground Railroad, of safe. Jacob had here, of enslaved people who'd made houses and secret signals it to Pennsylvania and beyond. They saved what little they could, planned their route in whispers, counted down the days until the new moon would give them darkness to hide in. But Thomas Fairmont needed money. The cotton market had shifted, debts were piling up, and human property was the fastest way to raise cash. Jacob was sold on a Tuesday morning to a sugar plantation in Louisiana, loaded into a wagon before the sun cleared the trees. Richmond watched from the kitchen window as the only light in her world disappeared down the dirt road, swallowed by distance and the casual cruelty of commerce. She didn't cry, not where anyone could see. She just went back to stirring the soup, her movements mechanical, her heart learning to beat around a hole that would never heal. The news came 3 months later with a letter from Louisiana. Jacob had tried to escape, made it almost to the Mississippi before the dogs caught him. They broke his legs first, then his spirit, then left him to die in a field where the sugar cane grew tall enough to hide the screams. The overseer who wrote the letter mentioned it like weather, just another note about damaged property and necessary discipline. Richmond read that letter once, then burned it in the kitchen fire. But the words were already carved into her memory, deep as scars, sharp as broken glass. That night, something changed in Richmond Cook. Not broken, not defeated, but crystallized. Like water turning to ice, she became something harder, colder, more patient. She still cooked with the same steady hands, still served with the same downcast eyes, but behind that mask, she was planning. Not escape, not anymore. Something else entirely. Something that would require all the knowledge old Mary had taught her about herbs and roots, about which plants healed and which ones killed. She began to study the men who came to Fairmont's dinner parties, their habits, their preferences, their weaknesses. Colonel Harrison always ate too fast, barely tasting his food. Judge Morrison had a sweet tooth that made him reach for seconds of anything with molasses. Dr. Whitmore suffered from gout and avoided anything too spicy, preferring bland fare that wouldn't aggravate his condition. She catalogued these details like a scientist, storing them away for future use. The pantry became her laboratory. Behind sacks of flour and barrels of salt, she kept her own collection of plants gathered from the woods beyond the plantation. Pokeweed, with its purple berries that looked innocent enough to eat. Castor beans that could be ground into powder finer than flour. Water hemlock that grew by the river, beautiful and deadly as a lie told sweetly. She dried them carefully, ground them slowly, tested their potency on the rats that plagued the kitchen. Each death was a lesson, each convulsion a note in a symphony she was composing in her mind. Winter turned to spring, spring to summer, summer to fall. Richmond cooked and served and waited, her patience deep as roots, strong as oak. She watched Thomas Fairmont grow richer from the labour of bodies he owned, watched him host parties where men celebrated their wealth built on stolen lives. She served their food with steady hands, cleared their plates with invisible efficiency, and all the while, she was preparing. Not just the meals they ate, but the meal they would remember forever. The last meal some of them would ever taste. The opportunity came with the harvest season, when plantation owners gathered to celebrate their profits and plan for the coming year. 8 men around Thomas Fairmont's dining table, 8 of the most powerful slave owners in Virginia, 8 monsters in gentlemen's clothing. Richmond had cooked for each of them before, knew their tastes, their habits, their arrogance. They saw her as part of the furniture, useful but unremarkable, a pair of hands that appeared when needed and disappeared when not. She spent 3 days preparing that final meal, roast beef carved thick as a man's hand, potatoes mashed with cream and butter, cornbread baked golden in cast iron pans, and the gravy, rich and dark and perfectly seasoned with ingredients they would never recognize. Each dish crafted with the skill of 20 years in that kitchen, but this time seasoned with something else. Something that had been growing in her heart since the day they took Jacob away. November 15th arrived cold and clear, the kind of Virginia morning that made the frost glitter like diamonds on dead grass. Richmond Cook rose before dawn, as she had every day for 20 years. But this morning her movements carried a different weight. Each step across the kitchen floor was deliberate, measured, like a woman walking to her own execution or her own coronation. She lit the fire with hands that didn't shake, filled the kettle with water that caught the first light streaming through the window, and began the final dance she'd been rehearsing in her mind for months. The menu was already decided. Roast beef, the kind that would make these men lean back in their chairs and pat their bellies with satisfaction. Mashed potatoes so rich they'd ask for the recipe their wives would never learn. Cornbread that crumbled like gold dust between their teeth. And the gravy, the centerpiece of every southern feast, the thing that tied all the flavors together into something worth remembering. She'd made this gravy 1,000 times before, but never like this. Never with such careful attention to every ingredient, every measurement, every stirring motion that would determine not just flavor, but fate. The beef went into the oven first, seasoned with salt and pepper and herbs that grew wild in the Virginia countryside. Richmond had learned to read meat like scripture, to know by touch and smell when it would yield to the knife, when the juices would run clear, when the fat would render into liquid gold. This roast would be perfect, tender enough to cut with a fork, rich enough to make grown men close their eyes in pleasure. It had to be perfect, because perfection bred trust, and trust was what she needed most. While the meat cooked, she prepared everything else with the methodical precision of a surgeon. The potatoes, peeled and quartered, boiled until they surrendered to her masher. Cream and butter folded in until they became clouds of comfort, the kind of food that made men forget their manners and reach for seconds without asking. The cornbread batter mixed by hand, poured into iron skillets that had been heating in the oven, where it would rise golden and proud, crackling at the edges the way cornbread should. But it was the gravy that commanded her full attention. She started with the drippings from the beef, that dark concentrate of flavour that formed in the bottom of the roasting pan, added flour slowly, stirring constantly to prevent lumps, watching the mixture darken and thicken over the flame. The smell filled the kitchen, rich and meaty and familiar, the scent of countless Sunday dinners and holiday feasts. She tasted it with a wooden spoon, adjusted the seasoning, added more salt, more pepper, a touch of thyme. Then came the moment she'd been preparing for. From the pantry, she retrieved a small cloth pouch hidden behind the molasses barrel. Inside was a powder so fine it looked like flour, ground from roots she'd gathered in the woods beyond the plantation. Pokeweed and castor bean, water hemlock and bitter almonds, processed with the skill old Mary had taught her, concentrated into something that would dissolve without trace, season without detection. Just enough to change everything, not enough to taste wrong. She stirred it in slowly, watching the powder disappear into the dark gravy like stars swallowed by storm clouds. No change in colour, no alteration in smell, nothing to suggest that this batch was different from any other she'd made. But Richmond knew the difference. This gravy carried 20 years of silence, 20 years of watching children sold away from their mothers, 20 years of serving food to men who discussed human beings like livestock. This gravy was seasoned with memory and pain and the kind of justice that could only be served hot. The guests began arriving at 4 in the afternoon, their carriages rolling up the circular drive with the confidence of men who owned not just land, but people. Colonel Harrison stepped out first, his military bearings still sharp, despite the years since his last battlefield. Behind him came Judge Morrison, whose courtroom had seen more freed slaves returned to bondage than justice served. Dr. Whitmore emerged from his carriage carrying his leather medical bag, the same hands that had declared black skin insensitive to pain, now reaching for the brass knocker on Fairmont's front door. They gathered in the parlour first, as was their custom. Glasses of bourbon and brandy in their hands, cigars sending smoke rings toward the coffered ceiling. Richmond could hear their voices through the kitchen wall, the easy laughter of men who'd never questioned their place in the world. They spoke of the coming winter, of crops harvested and profits counted, of new legislation that would tighten the laws around runaway slaves. Their voices carried the casual cruelty of men discussing the weather, as if human suffering was just another business concern. Thomas Fairmont played the perfect host, refilling glasses and steering conversation toward topics that pleased his guests. He spoke of his recent purchase of a family from South Carolina, how he'd managed to negotiate the price down by separating the mother from her youngest child. The others nodded appreciatively, offering their own stories of profitable separations and successful punishments. Dr. Whitmore described a new procedure he'd developed for treating rebellious slaves, a surgical technique that left no visible scars but ensured compliance. Judge Morrison laughed as he recounted a case where he'd sentenced a man to death for stealing bread to feed his starving children. Richmond listened to every word as she moved between kitchen and dining room, setting the table with Thomas Fairmont's finest china, polishing silver that gleamed like captured moonlight. Each place setting was arranged with mathematical precision, each glass positioned exactly where it should be. The centerpiece was a bouquet of autumn flowers, chrysanthemums and asters that had somehow survived the first frost, their colours bright against the white tablecloth, like blood on snow. At 6 o'clock precisely, she rang the dinner bell. The sound echoed through the house, calling the men to their final feast. They filed into the dining room with the satisfied air of conquerors claiming their prize, taking their seats around the mahogany table that could have fed a dozen families for a year. The candlelight flickered across their faces, casting shadows that made them look like the demons they'd always been, just better dressed. The roast beef was carved at the table with ceremony, Thomas Fairmont wielding the carving knife like a sword, each slice falling away to reveal the perfect pink interior. The men praised the meat's tenderness, its flavour, the skill of the cook who'd prepared it. They loaded their plates with potatoes and cornbread, reaching across the table with the familiarity of old friends and fellow conspirators. But it was when the gravy boat appeared that Richmond's heart began to race. She carried it in herself, the sterling silver vessel heavy in her hands, its contents still steaming from the kitchen fire. She set it down in the centre of the table, within easy reach of every guest, then stepped back into the shadows, Todd impassive, her watch. Her face remained hands steady, but inside her chest, something wild and terrible was singing. Colonel Harrison was the first to reach for it, ladling the dark gravy over his beef and potatoes with generous enthusiasm. Judge Morrison followed, then Dr. Whitmore, then the others, each man taking his portion of what Richmond had prepared especially for them. They ate with the confidence of men who'd never questioned where their food came from, who'd never wondered about the woman who stood in the shadows watching every bite. The conversation continued as they ate, punctuated by appreciative murmurs about the food and requests for seconds. They discussed the upcoming election, the possibility of new territories opening to slavery, the profits to be made from human cargo. Richmond served wine and cleared empty plates, invisible as always, just another piece of property performing her function. It was Judge Morrison who noticed something first. He paused mid-sentence, his fork halfway to his mouth, a slight frown crossing his features. Then he set down his utensils and pressed his hand to his stomach, his face taking on a peculiar pallor. Colonel Harrison glanced at him with concern, then felt his own gut clench with sudden violent pain. The poison worked quickly, more efficiently than Richmond had dared hope. One by one, the men began to show signs of distress, sweating despite the cool evening air, hands trembling as they reached for water glasses, faces flushing, then draining of colour like tide pools at low water. Dr. Whitmore, with his medical training, was the first to understand what was happening, but by then it was too late to do anything but watch his fellow diners succumb to the same fate. Richmond remained in her position by the serving door, watching the chaos unfold with the detached interest of a scientist observing an experiment. This was what 20 years of patience looked like. This was justice, served at the proper temperature, seasoned with memory and pain and the names of every person these men had bought and sold and destroyed. The screaming started when Colonel Harrison tried to stand and collapsed instead, his chair clattering backward as his body convulsed on the Persian rug. Judge Morrison followed, then Dr. Whitmore, then the others, until the elegant dining room became a scene from the depths of hell. They writhed and foamed and called out for help that would never come, their fine clothes soaked with sweat and worse things, their dignity stripped away like everything else they'd taken from others. Thomas Fairmont sat frozen at the head of his own table, watching his guests transform from men into writhing shadows of themselves. His face had gone white as his finest china, eyes wide with the dawning realization that this was no accident, no spoiled meat or tainted wine. This was something else entirely, something deliberate. His gaze found Richmond in the doorway, still holding the empty gravy boat, still wearing that mask of perfect servitude. But now he could see what lurked behind it. 20 years of accumulated rage, patient as winter, deadly as spring flood. He tried to speak her name, tried to ask why, but his throat had already begun to close. The words came out as whispers, then gasps, then nothing at all. Richmond stepped forward, not to help, but to watch, to witness the moment when Thomas Fairmont understood that his property had never belonged to him at all, that she had been counting, cataloguing, preparing for this reckoning since the day Jacob disappeared down that dusty road. Dr. Whitmore, even as his body betrayed him, managed to crawl toward his medical bag. His hands shook as he fumbled with the brass clasps, searching for something, anything that might counteract what was coursing through their veins. But Richmond had studied his remedies too, had watched him treat the sick and injured among the enslaved with the same detached curiosity he now applied to his own mortality. She knew there was nothing in that leather satchel that could undo what she had done. The damage was already spreading through their systems like wildfire through dry grass. Judge Morrison, the man who had sent countless souls back into bondage with the tap of his gavel, now lay curled on his side like a child. His mouth moved in what might have been prayer, but no sound emerged. Richmond wondered if he was thinking of the families he had torn apart, the freedom papers he had declared fraudulent, the lives he had crushed with legal precedent and moral blindness. She hoped he was. She hoped his final moments were filled with the faces of everyone he had wronged. The other guests followed in rapid succession, men who had built their fortunes on stolen labour, who had justified their cruelty with scripture and science, who had convinced themselves that their victims were less than human. Now they discovered what it felt like to be powerless, to have their fate decided by someone they had never bothered to see as fully human. The irony was not lost on Richmond. For 20 years, these men had decided who lived and who died, who stayed together and who was sold away. Tonight, she was returning the favour. The house fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the settling of old wood in the cooling evening air. 8 bodies lay scattered around the dining table like broken dolls, their final feast congealing on plates that would never be cleared. Richmond set down the gravy boat and walked slowly around the table, looking at each face, memorizing this moment. Not because she took pleasure in their suffering, but because she needed to carry it with her. Proof that justice, however delayed, could still find its way to the truth. She thought of old Mary then, wondering if her spirit was watching from whatever place the ancestors gathered. Mary, who had taught her that knowledge was power, that patience was a weapon sharper than any blade. She thought of Jacob, of the letter that described his broken legs and broken spirit, of the love that had been murdered as surely as if they had put a bullet through his heart. She thought of her mother screaming her real name across the rice fields, of Aduni who had died on an auction block so Richmond Cook could be born. The clock in the hallway chimed 9 times, each note echoing through rooms that had witnessed decades of casual cruelty. Richmond knew she had perhaps an hour before someone came looking, before the absence of laughter and conversation from the dining room raised questions that would lead to discoveries. An hour to decide what came next, whether to run or stay, whether to face whatever consequences awaited, or disappear into the Virginia countryside like smoke dissipating in wind. She walked back to the kitchen one final time, her domain for 20 years, the place where she had learned to transform raw ingredients into sustenance and comfort. The pot still simmered on the stove, the leftover beef still rested on its platter, the cornbread still sat warm in its iron skillet. Everything looked normal, peaceful even, as if this were just another evening of serving the master's guests. But the empty poison pouch hidden behind the molasses barrel told a different story. The carefully planned menu, the precisely timed doses, the patient accumulation of botanical knowledge, all of it had led to this moment. Richmond untied her apron and folded it neatly, placing it on the kitchen table beside the wooden spoon she had used to stir that final batch of gravy. She walked to the window and looked out at the quarters where the other enslaved people lived, their cabins dark now in the late evening. None of them knew what had happened in the big house. None of them would be suspected when the bodies were discovered. That had been part of her plan too, to ensure that her act of vengeance would not bring retribution down on innocent heads. From her small room behind the kitchen, she retrieved the cloth bundle she had prepared months ago. A change of clothes, the few coins she had managed to save, a lock of hair from Jacob's head that she had kept wrapped in paper. Not much to show for 20 years of life, but enough to carry her forward into whatever came next. She thought about heading north, following the routes Jacob had dreamed of, seeking the freedom they had planned to find together. But freedom felt different now. Hollow somehow, like a victory that had cost too much to celebrate. Instead, she found herself thinking of other kitchens, other plantation houses where women like her stood in shadows stirring pots and swallowing rage. Places where children were still being sold away from their mothers, where men like Thomas Fairmont still counted human beings like coins in their pocket. The poison she had used tonight came from plants that grew throughout the South, knowledge that could be shared, techniques that could be passed along like recipes handed down through generations of cooks. She walked through the house one final time, past the parlour, where the men had laughed about their profits, past the study where Thomas Fairmont kept his ledgers of human property, past the bedrooms where he slept soundly while families were torn apart in his name. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the hallway, marking time that no longer belonged to any of them. At the front door, she paused and looked back at the dining room where 8 of Virginia's most powerful slave owners had discovered that their power had limits after all. The night air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves. Richmond stepped off the front porch and onto the circular drive where carriages still waited. Their drivers dozed on their seats, unaware that their passengers would never need transportation again. She could take one of the carriages, she realized, drive it north until the horses gave out, then continue on foot. But something held her back, some sense that her story was not finished, that this night was not an ending, but a beginning. She thought of the other women in other kitchens, women whose names had been taken and replaced with descriptions of their function. Women who stirred pots with hands that remembered different spices, different songs, different languages. Women who watched their children sold away and their men broken by whips and their spirits crushed by systems designed to make them forget they had ever been human. Tonight had been for Jacob, for old Mary, for her mother, Aduni. But tomorrow could be for all the others. Richmond Cook walked down the long drive that led away from Fairmont Manor, her footsteps silent on the packed earth. Behind her, the house stood dark and quiet, holding its secrets close. The men inside would be discovered eventually. Their deaths would be investigated. Their murders would become legend whispered in quarters and cabins throughout Virginia. Some would call her a monster. Others would call her a hero. She was neither, really. She was simply a woman who had remembered her own humanity in a world that had tried to steal it from her. The road stretched ahead into darkness, leading toward other plantations, other kitchens, other women who knew the weight of wooden spoons and the power of perfectly seasoned meals. Richmond had learned that the difference between medicine and poison was just a matter of dosage, that the line between cooking and killing was thinner than most people imagined. She had 20 years of knowledge burning in her memory, 20 years of botanical secrets and culinary skills that could be used for healing or harm. As she walked through the Virginia night, Richmond Cook began to plan her next meal. The Underground Railroad had many conductors, but few people knew about the network of kitchens that ran parallel to those hidden routes. Richmond Cook became something new as she walked the dark roads of Virginia. Not just a fugitive, not just a murderer, but a teacher carrying lessons, written in blood and measured in teaspoons. She found her first student 3 counties over, in a plantation kitchen that smelled of lye soap and desperation. The woman's name was Clara, though she answered to whatever the master called her that day. Her hands were scarred from years of handling cast iron fresh from the fire, her back bent from decades of stirring pots that fed people who saw her as livestock. When Richmond appeared at her kitchen door just before dawn, Clara knew without being told that this visitor carried secrets worth hearing. They spoke in whispers while the morning biscuits rose in the oven. Richmond's voice was steady, clinical, as she described the plants that grew wild in Virginia soil, how pokeweed berries could be ground into powder, fine as flour, how water hemlock looked innocent as parsley, but carried death in every leaf, how castor beans, when processed correctly, became invisible in any dark sauce. Clara listened with the intensity of a woman learning scripture, her eyes wide with the possibility of power she'd never imagined holding. The lesson lasted only an hour. Any longer would draw suspicion from the overseer who counted minutes like coins. But it was enough. Richmond left behind a small cloth pouch hidden beneath Clara's mattress, along with instructions whispered like prayers. Not for immediate use, but for the right moment. The moment when patience finally wore thin, when silence finally found its voice, when the stirring spoon became something more than a kitchen tool. Word travelled through the network of women who cooked and cleaned and served. Not spoken aloud, never written down, but passed along in glances and gestures, in the way one woman's hand lingered on another's shoulder, in recipes shared with ingredients left deliberately vague. They called her the seasoning woman, the one who knew which herbs brought sleep and which brought silence forever. Some said she was a ghost, a spirit of vengeance that appeared in kitchens when justice needed serving. Others knew better. They knew she was flesh and blood, a woman who had learned to transform botanical knowledge into biblical wrath. Richmond moved through the South like smoke through trees, never staying long enough to be caught, never leaving empty-handed. Each plantation brought new students, new kitchens where women bent over steaming pots and dreamed of different endings. She taught them to read the signs in their master's habits, to catalogue weaknesses like spice measurements, to understand that the difference between seasoning and sentencing was just a matter of proportion. In South Carolina, she found a woman named Bess who cooked for a judge known for sending runaway slaves back to their owners with sentences that guaranteed they'd never run again. Bess had lost 3 sons to his courtroom, watched them dragged away in chains because they dared to dream of freedom. Richmond taught her about bitter almonds, how their scent could be masked by vanilla and cinnamon, how they could turn a man's favourite pound cake into his final confession. In Georgia, there was Sarah, whose master's son had developed a taste for young girls in the quarters. Sarah ground herbs with the methodical precision of a woman preparing communion, her wooden mortar and pestle worn smooth by years of use. Richmond showed her which mushrooms grew in the deep woods, how to dry them properly, how to powder them fine enough to disappear in gravy thick enough to hide sins. The deaths began to follow a pattern that law enforcement couldn't ignore. Plantation owners across 3 states, all found dead after dinner parties, all apparently victims of sudden illness that struck without warning. The newspapers called it a plague, some mysterious disease that seemed to target only the wealthiest slaveholders. Doctors were baffled by symptoms that resembled poison, but left no trace in the blood. Ministers preached about divine judgment, about the sins of slavery finally calling down wrath from heaven. But the women in the kitchens knew better. They whispered stories of the seasoning woman, of lessons learned in the dark hours before dawn, of recipes that carried more than flavour. They spoke of justice served at the proper temperature, of patience finally rewarded, of the day when the stirring spoon stopped being a tool of servitude and became an instrument of retribution. Richmond aged years in months as she travelled the circuit of plantations and manor houses. Her hair grew grey at the temples. Her hands developed new lines from grinding roots and measuring powder. Her eyes took on the hollow look of someone who had seen too much death to sleep peacefully. But she didn't stop, couldn't stop. Every kitchen held another student, every plantation another classroom, every meal another opportunity to balance scales that had been weighted against her people for generations. The authorities began to make connections. Reports of a mysterious woman appearing at plantations just before the master's death. Descriptions varied. But the pattern was clear enough to make nervous men hire tasters for their food, bodyguards for their dining rooms, investigators to hunt for the source of this culinary plague. Richmond learned to be more careful, to teach her lessons in whispers that faded like steam, to leave behind only the knowledge itself, carried in the minds of women who looked innocent as Sunday morning. In Alabama, she encountered resistance for the first time. A kitchen slave named Ruth, who listened to Richmond's lessons with growing horror, who crossed herself repeatedly and spoke of damnation and hellfire. Ruth believed in a different kind of justice, the kind that came after death, that rewarded the patient and punished the wicked in some distant heaven. She couldn't understand how Richmond slept at night, how she carried the weight of so many deaths without breaking under the burden. Richmond's answer was simple. She slept because Jacob couldn't. She carried the weight because someone had to. She taught women to kill because they'd already been taught to die, slowly, quietly, invisibly, their spirits ground down like grain in a mill. At least this way they could choose when the grinding stopped. Not all of her students used the knowledge she gave them. Some kept it like insurance, a final option for when all other options ran out. Others applied it immediately, with the enthusiasm of people who had been waiting their entire lives for permission to fight back. Richmond didn't judge either choice. She simply planted seeds of possibility in minds that had been taught to accept impossibility, then moved on to the next kitchen, the next lesson, the next woman who needed to know that powerlessness was not permanent. The manhunt intensified as the body count rose. Federal marshals joined local sheriffs in searching for the source of what newspapers had begun calling the Southern Poison Plague. Rewards were offered, informants cultivated, entire counties searched house by house, but Richmond moved through their nets like water through fingers, helped by a network of women who saw her as salvation, not criminal. When the law came calling, she was already gone, disappeared into the next county, the next kitchen, the next lesson that needed teaching. She began to vary her methods, teaching women to be creative in their applications of botanical knowledge. Not every death had to look like poisoning. Some could appear accidental. Masters who slipped on wet floors and cracked their skulls, who choked on bones that somehow found their way into carefully prepared stews, who suffered fatal allergic reactions to ingredients their cooks had used for years without incident. The key was patience, planning, and the understanding that justice didn't always have to announce itself with trumpets. By the spring of 1854, Richmond had traveled through 7 states and taught her deadly curriculum to more than 50 women. The Southern plantation system was hemorrhaging masters faster than it could replace them, creating chaos in the slave markets and uncertainty among the ruling class. Some slaveholders began selling their human property and moving to cities, claiming the rural life no longer agreed with them. Others hired teams of guards and food tasters, turning their dining rooms into armed camps where every meal was treated as a potential battlefield. The irony wasn't lost on Richmond. The same system that had treated enslaved people as property, as things to be bought and sold and discarded, was now terrified of the very people it claimed to own. Masters who had slept soundly while families were torn apart now lay awake wondering if their morning coffee would be their last. Men who had casually ordered beatings and brandings now jumped at shadows, suspicious of every servant, every meal, every moment of vulnerability. But Richmond knew the real victory wasn't in the fear she'd created among slaveholders. It was in the transformation she'd witnessed among the women she taught. Students who had shuffled into their lessons with downcast eyes and broken spirits, who left walking taller, speaking louder, carrying themselves like people who remembered they had choices. Even those who never used the knowledge she gave them seemed changed by simply knowing they possessed it. The possibility of resistance, once planted, grew in ways that couldn't be measured in body counts or newspaper headlines. She thought often of old Mary in those days, wondering what her teacher would have made of the curriculum Richmond had developed. Mary had taught her that knowledge was power, that understanding the properties of plants and herbs could mean the difference between healing and harm. She'd probably never imagined her lessons would be used on such a scale, with such deadly efficiency. But Richmond suspected Mary would have approved. After all, she'd been the one to say that sometimes the only cure for poison was more poison. The network of kitchen conspirators grew beyond Richmond's ability to track or control. Women who had never met her began teaching lessons they'd learned secondhand, passing along recipes for revenge like family heirlooms. The knowledge spread through the slave quarters like wildfire, carried by field hands who moved between plantations, by house servants who attended their masters to social gatherings, by women who met at church services and quilting circles, and shared more than prayers and patterns. The Richmond Cook case was officially closed in 1857, filed away as an unsolved series of deaths attributed to unknown causes. But Richmond herself was never caught, never tried, never executed. Some say she died of old age in a cabin deep in the Appalachian Mountains, surrounded by jars of dried herbs and handwritten recipes that contained more than cooking instructions. Others claim she lived long enough to see the Civil War end slavery, that she watched from the shadows as the system she'd spent years poisoning finally collapsed under its own weight. But the truth is simpler and more powerful than any legend. Richmond Cook didn't just kill 8 men in a Virginia dining room. She planted seeds of resistance that grew into a forest of rebellion, taught lessons that echoed through generations of women who refused to accept powerlessness as permanent. She proved that knowledge could be deadlier than chains, that patience could be sharper than whips, that even the most invisible people could reshape history one carefully seasoned meal at a time. If this story stirred something in you, it's because her legacy lives on in every act of quiet resistance, every moment when the powerless refuse to stay silent, every time someone transforms their kitchen from a place of servitude into a site of reckoning.